Welcome to Then and Now, a podcast by the UCLA Luskin Center for History and Policy. We study change in order to make change, linking knowledge of the past to the quest for a better future. Every other week, we examine the most pressing issues of the day through a historical lens, helping us understand what happened then and what that means for us now.
Hello, I'm David Myers, host of Then and Now. We're in the midst of one of the most powerful and destructive natural disasters in U.S. history, the Los Angeles wildfires. Today's guest, Stephen Pyne, Professor Emeritus at Arizona State University, is the author of 40 books, many of which are devoted to fire. In his extraordinary body of work, he urges us to understand that we live in the age of the fire, what he calls the Pyrocene, the latest of three stages in the history of fire in the world. Throughout his career, Professor Pyne has offered a sweeping history of fires covering thousands of years. His perspective is drawn not only from wide-ranging scholarly depth and original thinking, but actual real-life experience in fighting fires in Arizona. Today's conversation takes up this big history of fire, while also seeking to understand what has unfolded so tragically before our eyes here in Los Angeles. Welcome to Then and Now, Steve.
Oh, well, thank you very much. Glad
So
to be here.
you've devoted a lifetime to studying, observing, and in fact, fighting fires. You're on the one hand, one of the country's leading scholars of fire, and you also served for 15 years as part of a fire crew at the Grand Canyon National Park, the result of which you say is that you became a pyromantic. So what drew you to devote your life to fire? And maybe you can tell us what it means to be a pyromantic.
Sure. I think, well, first of all, a pyromantic is not a pyromaniac. That's a critical distinction. A pyromantic, I think, is someone who is interested in fire as a feature of the planet and of human life and culture, and is prepared to sort of see phenomenon through a pyric prism, if you will. So I tried to see, how does this look? What is this story? Not just put the fire story into existing sort of traditions and historiography, but think, what does it look like if fire is the central feature or the humanity in fire?
Did that perspective emerge out of your actual real-life experience fighting fires?
Yes, it had to. You know, I mean, when I went to school, college and then graduate school, fire was never taught anyplace. It wasn't taught any place in the country at that point. It was something you learned on the job. It was a part-time seasonal occupation. But I got interested in fire, and after I finished my doctorate in 1976, I wrote a biography of an American geologist and explorer. I was unemployed, working on the south rim of the canyon in a winter seasonal position until the fire season could start up again, and realized I really was interested in fire. And why couldn't I take the training I'd been given and see if I could apply that to fire? What would that look like? And it would put fire at the center. And so fire would be a constant presence. And in my first book, sort of unimaginatively titled Fire in America, that's the formula. And then later I learned to make fire a kind of informing principle in the literary sense, that provides the narrative arc and organizing conceit for the whole project. So I now think of fire history in two senses. One is the history of fires and fire regimes and all of that stuff, but the other is to use fire to better understand the cultures, the societies, and institutions. So, you know, lots of.
And I suppose there's a third sense, which is that you understand us to be living in the age of fire. It's not just that you see fire as the prism through which to view the world. You argue that our current age is the age of what you call the Pyrocene. Can you explain what that means?
Well, let me explain the origin, where that may have come from, at least mentally, is that on a fire crew, you quickly realized how seasons are organized by fires. That's your life. And if you keep coming back, as I did, you begin to appreciate how fire seasons organize your personal life over a longer period. And so what I've done is basically project that personal experience out into countries, continents, and eventually the globe. I now think that we have our management of fire or mismanagement of fire, all the ways we use fire, burning in living landscapes, burning fossil fuels, or what I call lithic landscapes, all of that, when you add it all up, we are reforging the planet. We are, in effect, creating a fire age equivalent to the ice ages. So if you take all the features of the big features, the iced over lands and seas, the biogeographical shifts, climate change, changes in sea level, mass extinctions, you sort of put all that together, but you pass it through a kind of Pyrrhic looking glass. And what does it come out? It looks pretty much like the world we're occupying now and actually intensifying. So this is my answer as a pyromantic. This is my answer to those who say the future is so strange, we have no narrative to connect it, and we have no analog. I think we have a great analog. We're creating the fire equivalent of an ice age. And that, for me, gives a kind of almost tangible sense of how all these different features we see are coming together.
I'm sort of moving to the end of the story but feel compelled to ask, does that necessarily mean that we're burning up?
No. I mean, part of my hope, and this is the abstract vision, this is the academic speaking, but it's also a grandfather, some of whose grandkids are actually married, and I've got to have hope for them, that we are the Earth's fire creature. I mean, fire is what we do that no other creature does. I mean, it's our place in the great chain of being. We are the keystone species. So we can do fire. Our relationship with fire, our ability to manipulate it in various ways, is so powerful we are remaking the planet. But that also means we have the power to begin undoing it. If this were some other things, or even if it were an ice age coming, we would be in trouble. But in a sense, but fire, we should be able to do fire.
Okay, we should be able to do fire. I want to just dig a little bit deeper into the Pyrocene and
Sure.
refer back to the sort of three phases that you identify in this evolution that has led to us living in the age of the fire. So there's nature's fire.
Right.
There's the first. There's humans' fire. That is to say, the emergence of human beings who could exert a degree of control over fire, unlike any other living species.
Right.
And now we're in a different era, which is the era dominated by combustibility, by combustion.
Mm-hmm.
Can you talk especially about that transition from 2 to 3?
Yeah, that's really critical. And part of it, understanding sort of the second fire, sort of, if you think of the old concept of a second nature, this is the fire equivalent of second nature. But it always happens within living landscapes. In other words, fire appeared on Earth when plants began colonizing continents. So all the ingredients, life supplied the oxygen, life supplied the fuel, et cetera. At that point, we start getting fossil charcoal. Okay, predates us, will post-date us afterwards. But their whole second fire thing had always been within certain ecological limits. That fire had co-evolved with these, and so there was always a give and take in these living landscapes. And we could push the boundaries, and we did. We could change it. We could expand seasons. We could rearrange it, but there were constraints. When we start going to fossil fuels, or what I think of as the combustion process of a third fire, all those limits are gone. We can burn day and night, winter and summer, wet or dry. We can burn in Antarctica if we want to. Those old constraints no longer limit what we can do. So historically, our quest for fire had been about finding new stuff to burn and new ways to burn it, because fire is power. It's a lot. It's a lot of other things, but fire power is a literal fact. But now we don't have those constraints. The problem is not finding new sources, it's finding sinks for all the effluent to go. There's no place for it to be absorbed. It's outside the whole realm of fire that had existed previously on the planet. I'm coming to think of this in a semi-whimsical way as geology's version of Jurassic Park. That we've taken something out of deep time, we've now plunked it down in the present. And it doesn't belong in this world. It belongs in another world. It has no place to go. And we're doing it at such a scale that not only does the effluent for our fires have no place to go, but all the plastics and the petrochemicals and all the other stuff we're generating out of this doesn't have a sink without upending the whole biota and indeed the planet.
Which raises again the question, is it the hubris of humanity to believe that fires can be contained in this age of the third fire?
Yeah, I think it was hubris that led us to it to begin with. And it seems to me no accident that at the same time the early steam engines are being applied to locomotives and boats and the rest, Shelley produces the new Prometheans. The Promethean myth is revived, and it's always Prometheus unbound. Prometheus was chained for a reason. I mean, it was a horrible punishment, but there was a reason you want it. You don't want it unchained, just on its own will. Well, that's essentially what we've done, and we were so pleased with it and all of our other innovations, new Prometheans. The Promethean myth is much more complicated than that, and there are other versions. One of the things about the Promethean myth, well, there are many versions of Prometheus, but mainly what it comes down to is power, that humans were weak, had no special skills, no survival talents. They get fire, and suddenly it all changes. They go to the top of the food chain. We got big heads and small guts because we learned to cook food. And we went to the top of the food chain because we could cook landscapes. And now, but there were still constraints imposed by the natural setting that makes fire possible. Now we're taking it out of another world and applying it here. All that's gone. And so we're liberated without those constraints.
And yet,
that's
one
hubris.
It's
just power. It is just power. We have reduced fire to power.
Yeah.
I mean, fire used to have a presence, and people could. What they knew of fire was what they saw burning, in their house, in their fields. There was some sense. One of the Enlightenment effects is to deconstruct fire into combustion. It loses its old habitat. It becomes separated from that. But we also abstract it into energy. So fire disappears. I mean, where is the fire department in a university? All the other elements have got disciplines and departments. There is no fire department, just the one that sends emergency vehicles. Well, that's starting to change. Now we're getting, centers and groups coming together to try to address it because it's such a problem. So we lost that relationship, and part of what allowed me to get involved is because when you work on a fire crew like I did, you think about fire differently. It's not just an ecological process. It's not just a tool. It's kind of animated in the same way that elk or mountain lions could be animated in your environment, or the trees. I don't want to say that some mystical connection here, but you just become familiar with it. It's just a part of your working world. And
and presumably there's a degree of respect for its power.
That's right. That's right. So, so that's the voice I was, and if you will, the vision I brought to fire. Mm-hmm. Why it was not just why could I put that at the center, because that's what organizes my life, or organized it back then.
I'm struck by some of the metaphors that you recall in your work about fire and our relationship to it, which seem to be born of a very Enlightenment sensibility. So I think it's the anthropologist Claude Lévi-Strauss who sort of distinguishes between the civilized and the barbaric. We are the civilized in part because we can control fire, as opposed to a prior primeval world in which humans or their predecessors could not control fire. I mean, it's sort of laden with value judgment, as indeed is Gifford Pinchot's analogizing the control of fire to the abolition of slavery. I'm curious what these kind of images, metaphors, judgments tell us.
Well, it reminds us, I think, that we do have and can have a relationship to fire. I just did an essay on fire as biology. We think we've made it a physical phenomenon, so now we can deconstruct it. We can make blow torches and put it in machines and the rest of it. But if you think about it in those terms, then your relationship is a physical one, and you think about countermeasures or control measures all have to be physical. If you think about fire as biologically constructed, which I think is fundamentally the case, I think of it not necessarily as alive, but like a virus. It's a creation of the living world and needs that living world to propagate. Then you might think about other ways to interact with it. Maybe it's more like a sheepdog than it is a blowtorch. Maybe there are some obligations. There's a different kind of relationship possible, and that historically I think has been true for most people until we get to the developed world, which is practically synonymous with a world that has made this transition to third fire and has it removed from their daily life. And then we're left with this paradox that all these really horrible megafires, particularly the ones burning into cities, are a pathology of the developed world. I mean, why is it that the countries that have the wealth, the science, and the technology are the ones that are being pounded? There's something fundamentally wrong in how we're living and how that translates into our relationship with fire. And there are alternatives. Well, Europe has a real problem with fire and control. I'm glad you cited that. There's a famous saying, you see it all over Europe, that fire makes a good servant but a bad master. And okay, that's right, but that's an interesting expression, social expression. Whereas others might have say, well, fire makes the best of friends and the worst of enemies. That is a different relationship and a different sense of who is in control, who is the master, who's the servant. Is that the real relationship we want? I think we're seeing the consequences of that. And that is also a form of arrogance and hubris, yes, but it's also, I think, a conception of fire that is no longer makes sense if it ever did.
So let's turn our attention, Dee, to urban settings, to modern cities, which you have written are designed not to burn. But they do, as we know. Why? If they're designed not to burn, why do they burn? And what are the most important examples that you think are relevant for our imminent discussion of what's going on in Los Angeles?
Yeah. Well, part of it is the age of the city. When was it built, and what fire codes or what understanding of fire was there and capabilities? And a lot of what's burning, even in modern cities, are the older parts of the town, just as it tends to be the older parts of the natural world that burn. It's part of a recycling thing. And I don't want to push that metaphor because it goes places I don't wish to. But cities used to burn very frequently. They were made of the same materials as the surrounding countryside. They burned at the same time in the same way. All of U.S. cities, major cities, burned multiple times under these. And then eventually we were able to replace the materials, design with fire in mind, and begin removing fire as a presence from urban landscapes. We didn't have urban conflagrations. I think San Francisco in 1906 was the last, but it took an earthquake even then to shatter the response to do it. And then we don't have it. And so it doesn't seem like, it's like a disease, a plague that went away. And now we don't have to worry about it because it's gone. And so we began rebuilding things and expanding new cities without really paying attention to the fire issue, the fire risks that were possible. And the assumption was that our own physical counterforce and machines and engines and airplanes and whatever could always beat the fire. And we're beyond that. It's very clear now with climate change plus other factors coming in with land use and so forth that we cannot pretend to control these fires under the worst conditions, which are becoming more frequent. But the worst conditions are exactly when you need it. They're the ones that do all the damage. So we've eliminated all the nuisance fires and the small stuff, problematic but not catastrophic. And now what we are left with is the worst case scenario.
So you mentioned climate change, and I want to just try and understand how you see sequence here in the age of the Pyrocene. Does climate change impel fire? Does fire impel climate change? Or is it some admixture of the two?
Well, they interact. So climate change, generally, as we're seeing, puts energy into the system. That's the global warming side, and then it's aggravating. So places that already are disposed to fire prone, have an exaggeration of that. California tends to exaggerate everything anyway in its natural composition, but we're seeing the fires exaggerated. So these are not unheard of winds, unheard of conditions, but they are now amplified well beyond what we had known historically. At the same time, converting these landscapes, particularly if they're forest, so forth, with really extreme severe fires, is releasing more carbon, which aggravates the situation. And so you get certain feedbacks. We're seeing this with the melting of permafrost, Arctic conditions, so forth. I mean, my literary imagination here is that there are all these legends and mythologies about the world ending in fire and then being reborn in some other form. So I think what I imagine is a kind of slow motion Ragnarok underway, where fire, the effects of fire in the atmosphere are changing the climate, which are encouraging more fires. The fires themselves are changing the possibility of what will renew. They're no longer conservative. They are slowly giving rise to something that will be suited to the new environment. And so with a series of little nudges and shoves, we're remaking the whole planet, basically. So yeah, there's a real interaction between them.
You know, as you speak, it seems hard to resist the impulse to lapse into literary and metaphorical renderings of fire because it's so powerful and mesmerizing, destructive, and in some sense constructive. But we are here in Southern California experiencing what is perhaps the worst natural disaster in the history of the area. Lives, communities, property, histories, large swaths of nature have been destroyed. So I'm wondering, through your very large macro historical lens, how do you see what is going on in Southern California, in Los Angeles with the wildfires today?
Well, I see it as part of this remaking of the world. And this is a particularly violent and horrific expression of it. But, Mediterranean Europe has also suffered from some very large and catastrophic fires.
Greece.
Lots of people, Greece, Portugal. Portugal, half of Portugal is a cinder. No country has been pounded so badly. A lot of Spain, all through the Mediterranean, we're seeing similar conditions. Part of what's interesting there, though, is the contrast in narratives explaining why this is happening. So observers can accept that climate change is aggravating the situation and making it worse. But the story in the U.S. is that the fundamental problem is people moving into fire-prone areas. But the story in Mediterranean Europe is people moving out of fire-prone areas. So lands that had been subject to fire, certainly fire capable, sometimes even fire explosive for hundreds, if not thousands of years there, were contained by cultivation. And the use of small fires as a part of that, making and managing and tending that landscape. And it was all broken up into mosaics, fields, pastures, orchards, woodlots, towns, all arranged in ways that would prevent an overwhelming fire. And now when people leave, that's no longer the case. The landscape goes into a monoculture, a feral monoculture, or in some cases is planted to industrial forests, eucalypts and Mediterranean pines, both of which are extraordinarily flammable. So yeah, it's the interaction of land use as well. So it's not just that people live in fire-prone areas. I mean, fire is humanity's superpower, if you will, and it isn't much use if you live in places that don't burn. So there are people who live on maritime, live off fishing, marine mammals and so forth, live on the coast and don't deal with the landscape behind them. But overwhelmingly, we like fire-prone landscapes, but it's how we live. And that's also a sense of how we see ourselves on the land. And so we have this Promethean story, which is really a story of power, but we also have a story of fire as a companion.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, even St. Francis, put fire in among the Song of the Creatures, Brother of Fire.
Mm-hmm.
And that seems to be much more prevalent in sort of pre-industrial societies.
Now, many who've adopted a more micro-historical lens, who've focused on more immediate conditions, have noticed or called attention to a mix of factors that include two very heavy rain seasons, followed by drought, followed by unprecedented dangerous winds, sort of that lethal combination. That makes sense, I assume, within your wider...
Oh, yeah. No, the climatic basis for fire is the rhythm of wetting and drying. It has to be wet enough to grow stuff and then dry enough for it to burn. So in desert areas, I live in southern Arizona, we get big fires in the desert after we have wet winters because all kinds of ephemerals and now invasive grasses, whatever, flourish and we get fires. Otherwise, we don't because there's not enough stuff to carry the fire. And in forest or wet areas, it's the reverse. You have to have these dry spells. Where you have an annual cycle of sort of sharply defined wet and dry cycles, as in the Mediterranean climate, it's an ideal formula. And on top of that, you also have these periodic droughts. So having 2 wet years, which are growing to grow the grasses, the shrubs, the small stuff, which is what is most responsive to the fires, and then have it snap into severe drought, and then you've got the right winds. I mean, there is no better formula for fire anywhere.
And from your perspective in southern Arizona, do you see mistakes that were made in planning, in prevention, in strategizing the fight against the fires?
Well, these current fires, I think it's too early to start. I mean, I'd rather have a couple of reports. We're going to have a lot of reports and commissions on this. And there's a lot of information and a lot of nonsense floating out there, and I'm not in a position to sort through it. Yeah. And I think it's unhelpful to speculate at this point. It's not too early to begin investigating and inquiring. It's too early to start making decisions. We know that the LA basin is extraordinarily fire prone. It has been forever. We know California has gone through these cycle of large fires since 1924, I think, is the first statewide event where there was a commission. After each one, there were recommendations, and part of the recommendations go for better firefighting, fire protection systems, and the other part try to get more of the fundamentals. How are people organizing the landscape? And what happens, not just in California but everywhere, is that the firefighting stuff gets emphasized, And the other stuff, the more fundamentals about how you actually organize your landscapes, how you live, how you build houses, all the rest of that gets deferred.
Yeah. So
Nobody
I
wants
wonder,
to make those decisions.
right. Very, very difficult to fight against those forces that seek to settle in places with beautiful views, even if they pose dangers. I'm just wondering, you have such a important and fascinating and wide-ranging perspective. Do you think we, as a general matter, get fire prevention wrong?
Uh, I think there are plenty of people who understand what's required. It's getting the social and political will to act on it. I mean, that's always the issue. I mean, fire is not something you don't have these fires every year, and so somebody, particularly if you have a lot of turnover in the local population, nobody's been through the last one. Um, it's really difficult, and that's not just true in the U.S. That's true everywhere. You're asking people to reorganize how they live. You're saying fire is systemic. It's not something that happens occasionally in some places. It's something that we can deal with seasonally. We can deal with it as a part-time job. That's never been the case, but we've treated it more or less in that way, and that's becoming clearer. So that's going to cost a lot, not just in money, but in attention and everything else. And that is a really, really hard thing to do. And a lot of people in the fire community have been fearing what we're seeing. And this is just the climax of, 20 or even 30 years, if you go back to the Oakland fire in 91, of this kind of urban conflagration returning. I mean, for me, it's like watching the plague come back or something. We thought we'd fix this to see this returning. And at each one, you think, okay, this has got to be the tripwire. This is finally we've gone off the edge on this, and people are going to really get serious and do something. And it hasn't happened. We've had changes at the margins. So for new construction requirements, changing some insurance, tinkering with this, tinkering with that. And I understand it. You want to do the minimum amount of invasive reform so people will accept it. But at some point, you've got to say, we've got to rethink the whole process and organize differently. And we haven't reached, I don't know if this will do it or not.
What does that rethinking look like? Can you give us some of the elements?
Well, I think it's going to be, if you're going, yeah, we know how to harden houses against embers, which is the primary problem. And we need to think about how do you organize collections of houses, because if you do it and your neighbor doesn't, you're still vulnerable. And we need to break up the landscape. You don't want to have monocultures of single flammable species. So they're all the same, but they're completely vulnerable. And that may be with housing developments as well as anything else. I've used the analogy fire, going back to my virus analogy, that fire spreads by contagion. I mean, it really does. You can model it in the same way. So what would you do if you're facing an epidemic or a pandemic? Say a COVID. Fire is a COVID phenomenon. Well, you have to harden against embers. That's what spreads the fire. Well, that's like wearing a mask against aerosols. You have to clear out a space around the structure, defensible space. It doesn't have to be a lot. It could be 3 to 6 feet. Well, that's social distancing. And then you have to have a collective response so that you can get enough herd immunity that you can really begin to control this. So there are other analogies possible. And if you think of it, in some ways it may be we have to quit thinking about fire only as a physical problem to be met with physical countermeasures and begin, maybe this is more like a public health issue, not just because people get killed or because of the smoke, but because of the way it spreads, the way it involves living landscapes, the way it involves people, et cetera, we begin thinking in new ways. So, I mean, I would hope that we could take these factors, which are known, find an equilibrium point between what would be a kind of ideal fire safe place, but also what people are willing to do, what they still regard as habitable. I mean, maybe we don't want to live in a concrete bunker, which would be protected against fire, but what trade-offs are there?
We could sort of herald the return of brutalist architecture and live in concrete.
Yeah, I mean, we can do that, but who would want to live there? It's got to be habitable. And actually, landscape architects are really taking an interest in this problem, both in Europe and the U.S., and becoming involved. And that's a really useful group to have invited here, because we want something that's attractive. We want to see something that appears habitable. I would like to live there. Yeah, it's got great views, but I don't want to look through gun slots of a bunker. I want to be able to enjoy that. What kinds of things can we do? That is a really tough discussion. And I worry that the country is not capable of these kinds of discussions without going flying apart. But that's what needs to happen. And then people can decide, okay, what are the choices we want to make? We need fire in this landscape. We don't want it in our cities. And these are not, this problem gets misdefined. It's called a wildland urban fire problem. It got actually in Southern California in the mid 80s from the wildland folks. And they saw the problem as houses and development encroaching on their ability to manage fires. But you can pick up the other end of that stick and say, these are really urban fire problems, complicated by peculiar landscaping. If you define it as an urban fire problem, it's pretty clear what you have to do.
Yeah. I mean, I appreciate your perspective look, but I'm wondering how we might situate the LA fires in a broader historical genealogy. We tend to think of this fire here in Los Angeles as we see the enormous destruction being wrought as without precedent. Can you give us some historical perspective on where this fire fits into urban fires in the modern age?
Well, I mean, all of, going back to the 18th century, American cities burned. They burned frequently, made of the same materials as the surrounding countryside, wind, drought, it'll happen, and then be rebuilt. Probably the most famous of that group is Chicago in 1871, which burned at the same time, under the same conditions, in the same way as a million acres in Wisconsin did under the same set of conditions. They were able to rebuild, and some of modern architecture was one of the consequences to come out of that. And thinking about new materials, San Francisco is probably the best example for LA right now. A significant chunk of that city destroyed. How was it rebuilt? What were the trade-offs and choices made? It hasn't burned since at that scale, so they got some things right. What can you learn from it? We have examples of places that are essentially destroyed and abandoned, but also renewed. I mean, modern London, the city grew out of the Great Fire that followed the plague. Yeah, I mean, one reason we have urban renewal programs now in modern cities is because we don't have these recurring fires that would have wiped out a large section and you rebuild. So there are lots of possibilities, but you need to think about what are the options. And there's also a sense of urgency here. These people have got to get back in houses. I mean, you've created thousands of refugees, essentially, and they need to get back as quickly as possible. But if all we do in our haste is to recreate the same conditions, then you're subject to the same event happening again at a time when climate and other factors are suggesting these fires will become more frequent and even more severe.
So as we move towards conclusion, I want to zoom out again and ask you to discuss your own strategy for living in the age of the Pyrocene. You mention or discuss in your work 3 propositions. I wonder if you can elaborate upon them. So first, we have too much bad fire. Second, we have too little good fire. And third, we have too much combustion. So, and by that, you say we do too much burning of fossil fuels. So how do you counsel us to move forward in light of these propositions? And I would say in light of a presidential administration very much committed to the burning of fossil fuels.
Yeah. Well, they're going to burn it, and we're going to be stuck with fossil fuels for a long time, and the consequences, even if we shut it down. So, yeah, we need to work on all of these at the same time, and they have different timelines. If we want, we can harden a lot of communities, even communities at risk in exurban and suburban settings. We could do that in a decade if we wished. We know what the points of vulnerability are. They're embers starting. And then the need to get enough of the community hardened that we don't spiral into an urban conflagration. And these really bad fires, for the most part, are ones that are affecting towns and human lives. So that is going to be our priority. But these are urban fires, and they need to be thought of as urban fires and not complicated, or having these fires supply misdirection to divert our energies into other things that really aren't mattering. These are cities, whether people think they're living in a city or not, they are. They are living in a modern city, and it is subject to all the fire risks and all the possibilities for preventing fire. I mean, everything in a city is there because somebody put it there. So we have, in principle, a lot of control. We don't want to create the fire equivalent of a police state, but we have a lot of control over this, and we can make intelligent choices among that. But we also have landscapes, living landscapes that are at risk. We don't really want to lose all of our mature sequoias. We don't want to trash municipal watersheds. We don't want to create public health issues with smoke palls and the rest of it. So all of these I would lump under preventing bad fires as much. And the city has got to be the first. If people don't see that that is the priority, they're not going to care about any of the rest of it. So that is the focus. Good fire is a longer range project. It's making our landscapes more habitable, and good fire can enhance a lot of ecological and reverse a lot of ecological deterioration. It can help prevent against bad fires by controlling the fuels and so forth. That is a complicated project. There are going to be all kinds of cultural issues involved. What is the landscape we want? How do we define a good fire in these cases? And we're way behind on it. There's a lot of ferment going on. So if we can create some conditions to promote it, I think we will see that improve. And the fossil fuel thing, I mean, it's what people have been talking about for decades now. It's getting worse almost annually, and now the U.S. is apparently that's out of my control, your control, but eventually it has to happen simply for economic reasons, if nothing else. But those are the three things we need to think about. And I think at the base, maybe reimagine our relationship to fire, and let's get rid of this Promethean image, whether it be tech bros or politicians or whatever, that we are not at war with fire. We are not going to destroy fire. We are not going to eliminate fire. We need fire, but we need the right kind of fire. And if we engage in basically abusive practices, fire will lash out. And I would note that we have a lot. We can communicate with fire in a lot of ways, but fire doesn't feel our pain. It's not listening to congressional hearings. It doesn't care about executive orders from the president. It doesn't care about injunctions from the courts. It will only listen to us if we speak in a language that it understands. And in a sense, and I don't want to personify it here, a language of companionship and sort of interdependence. And at that point, it will be much more responsive and helpful, and we can help steer it so it's not trashing things. That's a tough one. I mean, I come at it because of my really eccentric, idiosyncratic experiences starting when I was 18, before I went to college or anything else, and gradually learn from that. That's not going to be common for most people, but something like that has got to be codified in the culture sufficiently that we can talk in intelligent ways about fire.
On that note, I'd like to thank Professor Stephen Pyne, one of the country's leading scholars and thinkers about fire, for taking time to be with us on Then and Now. Thank you, Steve.
Oh, my pleasure. Thanks. Thanks for great questions.
Thank you for listening to Then and Now, a podcast by the UCLA Luskin Center for History and Policy. You can learn more about our work or share your thoughts with us at our website, luskincenter.history.ucla.edu. Our show is produced by David Myers and Rosalind Campbell, with original music by Daniel Reichman. Special thanks to the UCLA History Department for its support, and thanks to you for listening.